Policy Officer at uAspire, and oops, sorry, something popped on my screen. And also Ruby Portillo, uAspire Student Advocacy Fellow and Junior at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Next slide, please. And next one, please. Thank you. So for those of you who are not familiar with TICAS, we are an independent nonprofit organization focused on research, design, and advocacy for student-centered public policies that promote affordability, accountability, and equity in higher education. Both nationally and in states, including California, we do work around increasing awareness and reducing the burden of student loan debt, improving access to available aid, and strengthening need-based grant programs, and protecting borrowers, students, and taxpayers. Next slide, please. At TICAS, we focus on financial aid's impact on both access and success. Historically, a lot of the focus has been on the access side, which of course is very important. Students need to have financial aid to be able to afford their tuition so that they can enroll in college. But equally as important, we also need to make sure that students have financial aid to facilitate their success. Do they have assistance to help pay for the required books and materials, nourishing meals and safe housing? Are they able to spend time in class and studying rather than working? So aid for non-tuition and indirect costs is critical for facilitating college success. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. For nearly a decade, we at TICAS have led Californians for College Affordability, a coalition of 30 diverse organizations, including our great partners at uAspire, as well as the 3 statewide student leadership groups and other civil rights, social justice, business, and other higher education advocacy organizations. And we're all united in strengthening need-based financial aid so that all Californians can afford to attend and complete college. We started this coalition about 10 years ago during the Great Recession, and over the years have worked to strengthen the Cal Grant program as well as engage in reform efforts. And then of course, this year during the onset of COVID and its attendant recession, have had to pivot to doing work to protect financial aid for our students. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for the next few slides, I just wanted to lay out the current college affordability landscape in California and really underscore the importance of total college costs and ensuring that we have financial aid to cover both direct and indirect costs. So as you can see here, this is the Bay Area in Northern California. And you can see here that we have a community college, Berkeley City College, we have Cal State East Bay, and we have UC Berkeley. Now, when we're just looking at tuition, the cost is quite different among these 3 institutions. However, when we look at the indirect costs, food, housing, transportation, childcare, books and supplies, we see that the indirect costs are much more similar, and therefore the total college costs are also much more similar. Next slide, please. So number 1, we see that the total college costs are much more similar. And we also see that there is real differences in the average amount of grant aid that our students receive. So somewhat counterintuitively, it can actually be more affordable for a low-income student to attend a UC than it is to attend the low tuition community college, because as you can see in this slide, average grant aid is much higher at the public 4-year universities. Next slide, please. And this is not an anomaly. This is not, a one-off, East Bay example. We have done this analysis for 3 years where we look at the net price calculators of 27 colleges throughout the state. What we do is we have taken the 9 undergraduate serving UCs and paired them with their local Cal State University and community college. We then ran a low-income student profile on each of these institutions' net price calculators. And what we have found is that throughout the state, low-income students, for low-income students, it's more affordable to attend a UC or a CSU than it is a community college. Now, that being said, I really want to underscore something else that's very important, which is that at all of our colleges here, low-income students would have to work more than 15 hours a week to cover college costs. We know that from a wide body of research that working more than 15 to 20 hours a week can be detrimental to student success. So even though we do see that some institutions can be more affordable than others, we still have a pretty significant affordability problem throughout the state. We also see the impact of college affordability challenges on low rates of full-time attendance at the community colleges. At all of the community colleges in our analysis, the majority of students attend part-time, and actually weekly work hours at these schools to cover the net costs, meaning what the students have to pay out of pocket after available grant aid, range from 24 to 40 hours a week. We're also seeing the impact on students' need to borrow student loans and how the need to borrow is disproportionately falling on low-income students and students of color. We've done research with both the University of California Student Association and the Cal State Student Association, and we found that while about overall half of students need to borrow while at UC or CSU, specifically at UC, 2/3 of Black graduates had to borrow, and at CSU, 3/4 of Black graduates needed to borrow. So we, again, are seeing the real impacts on equity from our affordability challenges. Next slide, please. So again, just wanted to really underscore the equity implications of our affordability challenges. We know that for students who come from families that earn $30,000 or less in income a year, they have to spend about half or more of their income to cover college costs after available grant aid. And we know that more than half of Latino students, 3 in 5 Native American students, and almost 2/3 of Black students come from families that make less than $30,000 a year. So this is, when we're talking about closing equity gaps, we're talking about, making sure that we have resources for our underrepresented and under-resourced students. Next slide, please. So for the next couple of slides, I wanted to talk about, the structural problems with the Cal Grant program. Now, compared to most other states in the nation, California has a relatively robust need-based financial aid program. But there are some major structural problems which have led to all of the reform efforts that many of us have been engaging in over the past several years. What you see here are 3 different rings. The first ring looks at the distribution of college students within California. So you can see that, for example, about 2/3, 65% of college students in California attend community colleges. The next ring looks at the distribution of Cal Grant awards, and we see that a little under 1/3 of Cal Grant awards go to community college students. And finally, the third ring looks at not awards, but Cal Grant dollars. And we see that only 7% of Cal Grant dollars go to community college students. So if we're looking at this and we're expecting things to be more equal, we would think, okay, well, if 2/3 of students attend community colleges, they'd be getting 2/3 of the dollars, or perhaps even higher, because we know that community colleges serve a higher number of low-income students. But because of the structural problems I'm about to go over in a moment, we see that Cal Grant awards and Cal Grant dollars are not distributed evenly across colleges. Next slide, please. So one of the main, I should say, structural issues has to do with the fact that if you are more than 1 year out of high school graduation, you have to compete for a very limited number of competitive Cal Grants. Due to the advocacy of our coalition and many others, I'm very pleased to say that a couple of years ago, we had the largest ever increase to the number of annually available competitive Cal Grants. We went from just under about 26,000 to 41,000. So, percentage-wise, that's a nice leap. However, we can see from this chart here that it really is a drop in the bucket when we look at the total number of eligible applicants every year. So again, if you are a recent high school graduate and you meet the basic eligibility criteria, minimum GPA, you don't exceed a certain income threshold, then you are guaranteed a Cal Grant award. You are entitled to 1. But if you're more than 1 year out of high school graduation, you have to compete. And what we can see is that every year, over 300,000 eligible applicants, not just applicants, but eligible applicants apply for a competitive grant when only 41,000 are available. And we know that the majority of the eligible applicants who aren't getting awards are living in poverty. So this is a real structural issue with the Cal Grant program. Next slide, please. Another major structural issue has to do with the size of the Access Award, which I know folks have been talking about today. For the lowest income students, there is a Access Award, a stipend that's provided to students to help pay for non-tuition costs. Now, when this award was created back in 1969, it was $900. If that award had kept pace with inflation, we know that it would be over $7,000 today. Instead, that maximum award is less than $2,000. And when we see from the Great Sears survey, from CSAC and other research that's been done, we know that our students across all types of colleges are paying upwards of $20,000 a year out of pocket on non-tuition costs. Yet the award, the Cal Grant, part of the Cal Grant award to help cover non-tuition costs is less than $2,000. So that's another significant structural issue with our current Cal Grant program. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, the Cal Grant program does well helping recent high school graduates with tuition costs, but not as well with older students and not as well with non-tuition college costs. And affordability challenges impact student debt, student completion, time to degree, and contribute to equity gaps. Next slide, please. So, what can we do right now to address college affordability challenges? Well, one of the efforts that we've been engaged in since the spring has been working on provisions that protect students' financial aid amidst the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So you may be familiar with some of the provisions in the CARES Act, the Federal CARES Act earlier this year, such as if you are a federal Pell Grant recipient and you have to withdraw from college due to COVID-19, you don't have to pay back any balance on the Pell Grant that you received. It's not going to count against your lifetime eligibility limits. We want to see similar provisions enacted for Cal Grants. There are also several low and no cost ways to strengthen state need-based financial aid. We at TCAS had our annual college affordability convening about a month ago, and really robust discussion with a lot of great stakeholders and experts from across the state who identified ways that we can actually work right now to strengthen college affordability with even working within the constraints of the recession that we're in. So for example, one idea is, we know that there's few competitive Cal Grants, and if we can get all of them paid out at the beginning of the year when timing, matters most for our least resource students, that's something that we can do that can be helpful. So that the awards are paid out on time. We also can do work to improve student access to financial resources beyond state financial aid, including bridging the digital divide. I know the Education Trust West is doing great work on that. Increased access to CalFresh benefits, and also leveraging system efficiencies and reforms to lower cost of a degree, including developmental ed reforms, and also making sure that we have a robust statewide longitudinal data system. Next slide, please. So with that, I hope that I provided some helpful background information, and I'd love to turn it over to my colleague Laura Kane to discuss more about their work on Beyond the College Bill, the hidden hurdle of indirect expenses.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. And everyone, feel free. I know we're at the final phase of this amazing day together. Feel free to chime in any comments or questions you have as we're engaging through. We'll be following up with question and answers at the end too. So first off, uAspire is a national nonprofit focused on college affordability as the key lever to advance higher education equity. And we have 3 impact models. We directly advise around 10,000 students a year in California, Massachusetts, and New York. We train practitioners in many states throughout the country, including California, and we also drive policy and systems change. So we often refer to ourselves as an action tank, trying to really leverage the front line and our experience in working with students in order to help address the systemic barriers that are really reducing equity in higher education today. And our session today is going to focus a lot on our recent report called Beyond the College Bill. So why talk about costs beyond the college bill? Number one, it's just really vital that too often when we say, what does college cost? The answer is tuition and fees. And this is absolutely incomplete, and it harms our students' ability to succeed. It harms our policy conversations from using the incorrect data and information, and it really limits our ability to drive the completion rates in our country higher, which will help ensure financial health as well. So the national data supports what a lot of our students tell us. Non-tuition costs are beyond 50% of the total cost of attendance. And the old phrase that students can work their way through college is now a myth. It's no longer the case that that is something that is feasible for many students to do. So many of our students work 2 and 3 jobs while attending through college, which is something we'll discuss later today. And it's very important to note that what students do is they pay the bill first, they pay the tuition first, and then they struggle to get by with all of the other additional costs beyond tuition or indirect expenses. These are the true completion costs in order to ensure that they get their return on investment of pursuing a higher education degree. The impact of these expense estimates and really trying to predict and let students know with transparency about what these costs are essential. The reason why is that many students choose where to attend based upon how much college costs. So once again, if we're not talking about the full college costs, students are really making decisions in the dark. Secondly, if the estimates are too low, this can really cause a lot of problems for students to have enough money to finish the semester. We hear time and time again, and in supporting our students, the struggle gets more intense as we hit this time of year, November and December. It's when the money runs out. It's when students add an additional job to what they need to add into their schedules because they're struggling to meet their basic needs. On the other hand, if the estimates are too high, students may take on Parent Plus loans or private loans in order to cover expenses that they actually don't have. And that can be a really big challenge as well. And at the front gate of that, perhaps students think that college can't be for them because the price tag just seems too far and too distant, so they don't pursue higher education at all. I first want to share a little bit more information about our research in terms of the costs are hard to find and hard to understand. So on the next slide, what is showing is some of our research in terms of websites. We looked at 820 websites in 5 states, including California, and we found that almost half of these college websites didn't have any information about costs beyond tuition. And the reason why we started with this is that's what happens when we're with students. We're trying to help them do the calculations and figure out what they need to be able to succeed in college. So where do we go? We hop on Google, just like we do for everything else, and we go to the college websites. Since almost half have no information or are out of date, right away students are struggling. Our research also helped show that only about a quarter did what we think is best practice, which is to provide an itemized list of what these expenses are and with the estimates with the actual dollar figure and amount included. We also found, on the next slide please, that the estimates really vary quite widely. We also found very inconsistent terminology for indirect expenses. So why do words matter? The words matter because the definitions follow. So for example, here we found 52 different terms used for personal expenses. And we've had students ask time and time again, what are personal expenses? What does that include? What doesn't it include? And some of those examples are listed below. These are really vital in order to make sure students, as consumers, can prepare for and plan for what they need to cover. We also notice that even within a singular college system, and sometimes between a financial aid offer at an institution and their website, the terms didn't match in those places either. Third, on the next slide, we also found that estimates vary quite widely. So in our research, we also did a lot of quantitative analysis of the amounts provided. And while of course estimates might not be the same from college to college, we did see in many different cities a trend that we're showing you here. So in Boston, specifically for students who are living off campus, we saw over $10,000 difference in campuses that were less than 2 miles apart. This is really very stark. And when you think about what this means for a student in making a decision, it would drastically affect their decision about where they attend and why. And while all costs don't necessarily have to be the same, we do think that it's especially important that these amounts are more consistently communicated and estimated so that students are really making the correct attendance and borrowing decisions that they need to be successful. So when costs are not transparent and when they're inconsistent, let's take a look at the impact on financial aid administrators and on students. So first off, this is really difficult. We interviewed several financial aid administrators and really learned a lot about the challenges that they face and the questions that they raise. So number one, there's many different approaches of how to do these estimates. Sometimes schools use student surveys, budget logs. Other times schools use mid-range or averages based upon meal plan or housing. Other times external data sources are used, but those external data sources sometimes have very large geographies, which can be a challenge. Lastly, sometimes they use bookstore information, but given someone who's a science major versus an English major might pay wildly different prices, that can also be complex too. Secondly, there's very minimal guidance given to financial aid administrators for how to do these estimates. We only found 2 states, California being one, that provides any guidance at all on how to do these calculations. The federal government does not provide it, and honestly, even vendors have come to us asking for advice about how to support their clients. A third area that can be difficult for financial aid administrators is around pricing pressures. This is a very market-based environment in higher education, and many times colleges compete for students with other nearby colleges. Lastly, communicating what can be really complex around financial aid is difficult. And many financial aid administrators find that one-on-one guidance is best, but that's very hard to deliver at scale. In terms of students, we found many consistent themes through both a student survey with over 150 students and 16 different student focus groups that we conducted. What we learned is that 51% of our students told us that they pay much more for indirect expenses than they thought, and this is what occurs during the semester. This slide shows that close to 50% of these students said that they experience significant stress each month, and over 88% of the students said that they experience significant stress at least twice a semester about whether or not they can afford the expenses they have. They have to scrape money together in order to get by. Next, we also see that timing of financial aid is critical. So the timing of when the information is given, especially in terms of scholarships and loans, so that they can understand where the money has been applied and when it hits their account, is very important. We saw many trends with that. Secondly, the disbursement of the money. Several times and in a significant number, students shared that they didn't have the money they needed at the beginning of the semester. And so we're really chasing getting up to speed in classes for many weeks, if not months, into their courses. Ultimately, this is very important because their experiences in covering costs beyond tuition negatively affects their ability to engage and complete their degree. They talked about many missed opportunities they had in order to, an inability to really get the full college experience. And this came up in terms of not being able to pursue internships because they were unpaid, or they needed to have money in order to do professional dress or transportation. It came up in terms of additional course requirements, such as paying for tickets to go see additional performances and such. And it really led students to many impossible choices between working more to pay for school or being able to be in school and really take advantage of their investment in their own degree and their experience on campus. And the other piece shows that 42% of students really weren't sure about whether or not they could complete their degree. So one is about their ability to engage thoroughly, and two is literally, should I re-enroll next semester? And that's something that's only been exacerbated during the COVID time. Ultimately, the majority of our students who are over 80% Pell eligible, dominantly from communities of color and first generation students, there doesn't exist a safety net for when life happens in order for them to face an unexpected expense without it negatively affecting their ability to succeed in school. And 38% of our students said they faced an unexpected expense at least 2 times a semester. So if you look at this chart, if you start at transportation, which is at 22%, that was often what students prioritized. This was done in pre-COVID times, this survey, because they needed to get to campus. And then as you move up at 41%, students start to sacrifice and trade off and make gambles about where they should put the limited resources that they have. So 41% of the times they would cut back on educational materials and supplies. Another 45% said they would add another job to increase their income to cover these costs, while taking away the available time to put toward their education. And lastly, over 53% said that they changed their eating habits in order to meet the unexpected expenses when they hit. So the good news is that there are many ways that we can help students, many ways to ease the burden. I want to talk a little bit about how institutions are doing that, as well as what we can look at policy. So first off, there's very specific supports that institutions are doing. And in our report, Beyond the College Bill, we have an addendum with 12 different promising practices with very specific information and often contact information to go learn more if you are from an institution and want to help replicate some great, strong practices to help students. So first of all, one area of innovation is around reducing textbook costs. And one example of this is from Maricopa Community College. They did $11.5 million of savings in 5 years for students in reducing textbook costs. This is also occurring in many other places and is very much a growing field around using open educational resources or other innovative means to reduce the overall cost of attending college for students. Another idea that we've seen many campuses work on is related to hunger. There are different ways that's being done. One is an example that is also occurring at UC Irvine specifically, where 61% of students said that the food pantry had a positive impact on their ability to persist in college. Also, the program Swipe Out Hunger has been doing amazing work throughout the country with students leveraging unused meal plans to help other students eat. Lastly, the subsidizing childcare is another example of how to support students to stay enrolled by addressing these unmet additional costs beyond tuition. The C Campus program is a federal program that has strong regard, but it's underfunded. It's a way that we can help support institutions to help their students. Another way that institutions are helping their students, next slide please, is around doing comprehensive support. So rather than taking one specific area and really honing in on that, another strong example are these 2 areas. So Amarillo Community College is one example in Texas that's doing phenomenal on-campus resource centers. And this is more comprehensive one-stop shopping in terms of helping students make referrals to additional resources, completing public benefit applications, support with tax help and form completion, etc. Also, another way that is more comprehensive is very specifically around emergency aid programs. These have been blossoming around the country and lots of strong research is going on and examples from many California colleges and others, and has been extremely vital for that moment when students are navigating the unexpected expenses. These tend to be highly related to costs beyond tuition. From a lot of the research, it shows that about 67% of emergency aid really stems from housing issues, whereas over half, 52%, stem from transportation issues. Moving from institutional ideas and innovations to address what can help students, there are also very many policy recommendations. Our report emphasizes 10, but I wanted to highlight 5 quickly with you now before introducing our student. First off, focusing on equity, 100% we need to increase funding of need-based aid. From a federal perspective, this can be from increasing the Pell Grant, extending lifetime eligibility, as well as considering a negative EFC. Clearly with the Cal Grant, there are many different strategies. There was just a session before this as well about how to modernize it and how to make sure that it is more equitable to provide to the students who need it most. Students coming from low income backgrounds, students of color, students who are first generation. Secondly, we need to really be thinking about how need-based aid can cover indirect expenses and costs beyond tuition. Too often, our programs from the state level are last dollar versus first dollar scholarships. And too often we talk about free college as a bumper sticker versus what often might be translated in policy as free tuition. So it's vital that we talk about the full cost of college and we really include these costs beyond tuition. It's also vital in terms of making sure that community colleges are fully funded per the examples that Laura gave earlier in the presentation. The third part about equity is to make sure we incentivize institutions to really reduce indirect expenses and these costs overall, such as the examples just emphasized around textbooks, childcare, and others. This is really important that we make sure the government helps colleges help students. Let's put the money to work in the ways that we know are going to be targeted at the students who need it most and in ways that can drive completion. The second policy area recommendation is very much around transparency. Ultimately, students are consumers and they deserve the information they need to make informed decisions. And this is vital when we can't even find the mention of cost beyond tuition on almost half of the websites out there for colleges. So we believe that cost of attendance should be listed on every website in an itemized fashion with common terms and definitions. So students have the vital information they need to make the decisions about where to attend and in what ways. Lastly, simplicity is very critical. We need to improve the guidance so that colleges can have more accurate and more consistent estimates for costs beyond tuition. Lastly, we really believe that simplifying access to public benefits is critical for students, both in terms of their eligibility to ensure they get the support they need and to ensure that the barriers to completion of those applications are reduced so that they can easily access the information and the funding that they deserve. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruby Portillo, who is a junior at UC Santa Cruz. Ruby has been a uAspire Student Advocacy Fellow since last January, and this year she is now a peer leader of the program. So it's my privilege to introduce Ruby.
Great, happy to be here, Laura. I would like to start off by discussing why I became engaged with student advocacy work. When I learned about uAspire and its student advocate program, I thought it was a wonderful way to become engaged with policy advocacy that directly affects me. I also thought it was very important for the voices of student advocacy to understand the unique and complex experiences that first-gen students of color face. My personal experience has been a struggle with indirect expenses from beginning to present. Student advocacy isn't a job that is completed overnight. We must continue to hold colleges and universities accountable in order to see effective and long-lasting change. I've often struggled to afford basic needs such as housing due to an overwhelming amount of financial responsibility that I have on top of all of my school expenses. I'm a first-generation college student, and housing insecurity has added substantial stress on top of the pressure of figuring out college on my own. I have taken out the maximum amount of loans since my first quarter at UC Santa Cruz, and I still end up with very little to no money for basic needs since I have paid for all of my course materials and other student fees. As a student, it is impossible to survive without a job to provide income for the indirect expenses that no one ever tells you about. Housing is so expensive in Santa Cruz County that the possibility of homelessness is a genuine fear for my friends and I. Without accurate cost of living estimates and sufficient financial aid, I face the risk of having to take time off of school due to a lack of affordable housing. This issue has only become exacerbated by COVID-19. For mental health reasons, I had to find a place on my own when I left Santa Cruz and transitioned to online learning. Had it not been for the kindness of strangers, I don't think I would have been able to find secure housing that I could afford. Some key indirect cost issues that some of my peers in the uAspire Fellowship are passionate about are transportation costs and food insecurity. both of which I have also faced. My peer Dixie has often expressed the difficulties of transportation when on campus parking permits are quite costly. It is difficult enough for many students to afford vehicles of transportation. I've had to take Greyhounds from Santa Cruz to Los Angeles during my entire college experience because of this. It is unjust to make transportation costs even more straining on students by making it a luxury to be able to park on campus. Without CalFresh, I would have had no other way to afford food when the pandemic first hit, and I lost my on campus job. The sad truth is that undocumented students do not qualify for programs such as CalFresh, leaving them with an even greater struggle to find means to get by. In order for those broke college students' stigma to change, policymakers need to start listening to students. The current Pell Grant allotments are not considerate of the current cost of tuition and the indirect expenses that come with being a student in higher ed. Students who are not able to rely on their family for financial support are left with excessive amounts of debt for the opportunity to pursue their desired career path. This trade-off is unfair at best and hyper-capitalistic at its worst. Financial instability impacts Black and Latinx students disproportionately, making it more difficult for us to be able to participate in career advancing opportunities such as research. Unfortunately, research opportunities are compensated solely by the experience itself and no monetary compensation. And oftentimes, students cannot afford to work less hours in order to be able to participate in such opportunities. This is an institutional barrier that must be both addressed and fixed. Affordable housing on campus would be extremely beneficial for students and may help lower the competitive cost of housing in the surrounding area of schools. Students shouldn't have to live cities away from their campus because of housing costs. Cost of living adjustments taken into account in financial aid is absolutely necessary. Food pantries with sustainable produce should be investments the colleges make for their students. There have been countless times where I have been to my school's food pantry and only been able to find canned tomatoes and stale bread. Free public transportation for college students would make it possible for more people to pursue higher ed. It would positively affect financial barriers that students face when seeking transportation and positively affect the environment by curbing pollution rates. Programs that help students should not have to be student-run and funded by students. Students should not be seen as pawns that are for profit, but people who deserve the assistance and programs to be able to live fulfilling lives while pursuing their degrees.
Thank you so much, Ruby. We would love to hear any thoughts you have, especially in the current climate with COVID-19. If you want to share a little bit about how has that affected your experience in all of these costs beyond tuition?
I think definitely my first experiences in March when all of this started happening was just a lot of confusion and fear. Many of us, including myself, lost our on-campus jobs, which was my only source of income at the time. And so I was left unemployed for about 3 to 4 months. And it was really difficult during that time to find housing, affordable housing, and most of us had to leave Santa Cruz County due to school orders, and I lived on campus, so I had to manage coming back home and doing school online and trying to find a place to live and trying to find employment. It was all really difficult. And I would say the continuing experiences that I have with COVID-19 is it's really difficult to learn remotely, and I still find it difficult. I find myself spending more time on assignments that would maybe take me an hour. I find myself taking 3 hours. And it feels like there's not enough time in the day for classes now. And I think that's been really difficult. It's been difficult for people to focus in class because there's a sense of detachment there. when you can't see everyone in person. Excuse me. So I would also say that it's much more difficult to build chemistry with your professors. With online classes, even during office hours, it's just a little awkward to talk to someone through a computer screen versus building bonds in person.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so the themes of work and balancing, clearly the housing, I recall, that was really significant. And then also how it affects your engagement and everything else with that. Thank you so much. And I know one of the, someone's chiming in here on chat. Thank you, Brooke, sharing. Just thank you so much for what you're sharing, Ruby, and also how her children are also experiencing similar things in the Bay Area with losing work with COVID and struggling with housing, et cetera. So you're not alone. And that really speaks to the systemic aspect of this work. So if you could go and talk to policymakers, which I know you're intending to do in the coming weeks with your advocacy program, where you're a phenomenal leader and such important work. What ideas do you have about what you want to say students need during this pandemic time and to address these costs beyond tuition?
I would definitely say that students need another relief fund. I know we were given one in the CARES Act back in March, but that money was only enough to get people back on their feet and to find temporary places to stay for many people. And so I definitely think that another type of CARES Act is well overdue for students who continue to struggle and continue to face housing insecurity and food insecurity for the past couple of months. And I would also like to point out that this isn't something that is only happening because of COVID-19. It's been a problem for years now, decades now, and people are still not paying enough attention to it, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, so important. Thank you so much, Ruby, for being here with us today and sharing all of your expertise and insights. And it's so essential that students are at the center of making sure we're defining these problems correctly and identifying the right solutions that will work for students. I want to invite everyone to please engage on chat and or go ahead, throw your camera on if you're feeling bold and crazy here at the final hour, final 15 minutes of our day together. We were going to do some polls. However, we're going to go a little more casual with our nicely sized group here. So would love to see people chime into chat. We'd like to know how often you discuss costs beyond tuition with your students. So whether you're someone who's a counselor on the K-12 side or working in higher ed, how often do you talk about these costs beyond tuition in terms of never at all, here and there, or all the time? Would love to just see chat comments about how much is this part of your regular work with students. And then Ruby, Laura, and I are all going to kind of chime in to see what we're seeing here. Thanks, Tyler, for answering that question.
Laura, if I may add one thing while folks
Please.
are answering that question. You know, first of all, Ruby, thank you so much for your incredible insight and very compelling feedback. You know, as I'm sure we're all aware, the CARES Act, unfortunately, the emergency aid provided in that, unfortunately, was not allowed to go to undocumented students. So I know that many of us did some advocacy in California and got $15 million in the state budget to provide emergency aid for undocumented students, which is really important. So hopefully with a new federal administration, we will see those benefits expanded to all students. But I just wanted to highlight that we want to just, of course, make sure that our undocumented students also receive relief as well.
Such an important point. Thank you, Laura. So it seems like that there are, many of you are talking about these costs all the time. A handful of you who aren't as student serving might not be doing it quite as often. But I'd love to know too, if people are finding that they have the information that you need. Are you also looking for accuracy and transparency of costs, or do you find that it's easy to get the information? So the question right now is it easy to find information about what these costs are? So Yes, easy to find. No, it's a bear. Kind of trying to look at the trends there. I'm also trying to capture, I see a couple questions coming in too. I see Elva's talking about how digging through each school. Yes, at each website, each school, taking a look in it. So kind of the consistency, LaToya Hervey's talking about how the consistency of California schools helps because then it's within only a handful of different institution types.
Looks like we have a couple questions coming in as well, Laura, that folks have been asking.
Fantastic, thank you. You want to go ahead and
Well, I was going to say I was one of those. It's Anthony. Hi. I was just going to say, like, you know, I often refer students to college websites because it seems like the most accurate place, but there's no rules or regulations about what they have to post. That just seems like there should be something.
Yes, it would seem that there would be. So that's some policy work that we're doing, and there isn't in terms of communication. There has been work in terms of financial aid offers. That is something called the College Finance Plan that technically is a federal law only for veterans, but whether that includes indirect expenses within individual colleges' financial aid offers, that's up to each college. In terms of websites, there is only net price calculator. So Laura, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the net price calculator policy solution and how that might be able to go in more detail around what the itemized aspect of cost of attendance is versus a lump sum.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, you know, the net price calculators they're really the only measure we have right now that's the closest apples to apples. You know, but I think one of the things that really needs to be teased out is how the indirect costs underlying the net price calculators are calculated. So, you know, I think that there you know, certainly is work being done around making sure that estimates are more transparent, that they're communicated effectively to students. I do think that net price calculators are helpful for students to get a broad sense of what they can be expected to pay out of pocket and to kind of have a relative sense of what it costs to attend one college compared to another. But certainly, you know, fine tuning the how those indirect costs are estimated across the board is important. And also, I do believe I need to double check this, but I do believe that there was a bill a couple of years ago in California that requires colleges to post the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment in the area on their website. But again, a lot of the work that's being done around it has kind of been piecemeal. So. Yeah.
Great, and it looks like there's another question from James. James says, in the research that both SpeakUS and uAspire have done, did evaluating financial aid award letters, did you find that in particular UCs and or CSUs were accurate with their indirect costs?
Sorry, my button wasn't hopping off. I can hop in and then Laura, you can say, I'm not sure if TICAS has looked at that too. Would love to hear your thoughts. So in trying to confirm if something's accurate, it is actually really challenging. We started with that to try to do an analysis, and because we were looking at 5 states, it became too broad. So what we did was do more comparison from between different schools and then within schools and geographies to look more at accuracy and consistency, if you will. We can say that between terms and formatting a financial aid offer specifically, there isn't a common aid offer format within those systems. And it's something that we've had some great conversations with the different sectors in California. We were excited to join the Community Colleges of California last March, but it was in the 20s of March, and that was a conference that got canceled because of our lovely COVID situation in the early days. And that was where we're going to talk and work with about 125 institutions and really thinking about this and how is the best way to communicate some of this information and how to do it more consistently. And we've also talked with the UC system. So we are really encouraged by many of the folks in California. And I think that a year from now, we might be having a really different conversation about how some of the California systems are leading the way on better transparency and communication. Laura, do you have anything to add from TICAS's work?
Sure. In a moment, I can put in the chat a report that we put out a couple of years ago. Don't focus on this part of our portfolio. So if folks have follow-up questions on the recommendations, feel free to reach out to me and I can direct you to my colleagues that work on it. But I'll just say that we think that it's really important to, number one, provide the full cost of attendance, that we need to be separating aid that needs to be earned or repaid from aid that does not, and that the net price must be calculated. So the total college costs minus grant aid and scholarships. So I'll throw that link into the chat. And again, I'll also put my contact info in case anyone has follow-up questions.
And ironically, I will say uAspire's website is down today of all days. And that is where all of our information is there. But we will have your emails and I'll be sure to send that out when things are up. Evidently, there is some massive outage of us. The folks who host us are hosting thousands of websites and it's been down today. So I can't give you the link. It would just be frustrating. But we have a report called Decoding the Cost of College, which echoes a lot of the great research by TICAS on that. And then of course, this piece around the On the College bill also gives some more detailed information about websites, et cetera.
I know we have a few more minutes, so I just want to make sure we answer any other questions that folks may have. I know it's been a really long day, so please let us know if you do have any questions. And if not, I don't know if Laura, or Ruby, if you all have any closing thoughts for us to really close out the summit today.
Happy to share just a couple summary thoughts. And thank you all for joining us today. I know it's been a productive day, a long day. Given the current pandemic and the recession, first and foremost, we need to continue to do our work to protect current financial aid recipients, and doing that by instituting measures that are similar to what have been implemented for the federal Pell Grant program. So for students who unfortunately do have to stop out of school due to COVID-19, making sure that they're not going to lose their financial aid permanently, that they don't have to pay it back, that it doesn't count against their lifetime limits. And also, while we very much remain a part of efforts to reform writ large the Cal Grant program, there really are many creative, no and low cost ways that we can improve college affordability during a recession. Of course, at the forefront of that is ensuring that we're looking at total college costs, including the key indirect costs, and just making sure that we can be creative and we can find ways to support college affordability even when state coffers are running low. So just want to put that out there, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Laura. And just a big shout out to Tyler, who started us out this morning with the DJ and the rest. And he's been, along with our other hosts, have all been just doing amazing work to make today happen for everyone. Also want to thank Ruby, of course, for all of her engagement. It's a core part of our work at uAspire to put students at the center, as we believe that they are the experts in all of this, and they will guide us to tell us what we need to be doing on their behalf and how to amplify their own voice and their own power to drive the changes that we need. And lastly, I would just say that, yes, like what can you do tomorrow when you start going back to a job as you know it post-conference? Number one, I would just ask you to really look at the language that you use. So when you're talking about college costs, double check. Are you really looking at tuition and just what's paid to the college, or are you talking about the full cost of attendance? So that's number one. Number two, teach. You're all educators who are here, so please do educate others, whether those others are students you're working with, colleges you're working with, or if it's policymakers and others, keep reminding folks that, actually, I think that's just tuition. Or when we're saying that amount, that data point, what does that include or what doesn't it? So go ahead and ask those questions and really teach by how you engage with others about it. And then lastly, think systemically. So really think about whether policy might seem like a big word over across the country in Washington, D.C., but so many policies that make a big difference are much like politics, and local really matters. So smaller policies that are within the practice of your organization can make a huge difference as well. So we really encourage you to be thinking in terms of what you say, in terms of teaching and what you do, as well as thinking systemically to help support students.
Wonderful. All right, it is almost 5 o'clock. I think this is officially the closing for the second annual California College Affordability Summit. I just want to once again thank everyone for being here, being present, being engaged. Thank you, Ruby, for being just such a staunch student advocate. Both Laura's for just taking the time to present today. Laura Kane, I know it's 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock where you're at, so thank you for being here, and really appreciate you all being here. So look out for an email from the summit planning team. We're sending out a survey just to really collect your thoughts on what we can do to improve for next year. Hopefully it won't be virtual. Hopefully folks can attend in person. But thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, night, rest of the night, and hopefully we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Tyler. Fantastic job.
Thank you,